All right, headed into the last round of the day. I've had literally zero time since the end of the previous video. There's about 12 minutes left until the next round, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to relax, and then we're going to play white. We're going to go for our King's Gambit. We're going to go all out, and then we're going to be able to go home kind of in an enjoyable Sunday here. Not a whole lot going on, so this is a good use of our time. And this has been fun. I am glad to be getting practice. I'm less and less nervous over the board, and I'm more and more interested in like, oh, is this a win? Is this a draw? Let's figure it out together. So that's fun. This has been good. I'm enjoying it. We're just gonna keep on keeping on. All right, see you guys after the game.
All right, so we're getting to our fourth round. So far, we're 1.5 out of 3, as you can see above. And we're playing white against Yukin Zhao. So we know what we play as white. We're an E4 player, and our opponent plays E5. So we get to play our King's Gambit. We love playing the King's Gambit. And so we play our F4, and our opponent plays F6. And I was like, that's got to be wrong. So first of all, something that I should know but did not realize until now is takes, and queen check picks up this pawn, and this is +7 for white for obvious reasons. You have to play here, check, king F7 I guess is best, and like pretty clearly this is terrible for our opponent. So we should have played F takes E5 here, but I wasn't really sure, and I was just like, yeah, this is going to be bad. Like we'll just come defend this pawn. Come attack this pawn. So our opponent defends, and we play bishop c4. And it turns out knight f3 is a better move than f takes e6 or f takes e5. But I think that playing in the way that gives our opponent a chance to immediately lose the game on move 3 is probably the one that we should play. We don't mind having the semi-open f-file anyways, and we have the opportunity to castle queenside. So I think in the future that's what I'm going to be doing. I just had never seen f6 as a defense to f4 before. Anyways, we play bishop c4, our opponent plays bishop c5, we play knight c3, which again I think is a good move. You can see, despite the fact that we, in theory, are gambiting a pawn, we actually nurse a healthy plus 1.2 advantage here. Our opponent plays d6. Now that they've gotten their bishop out here, they have like this pretty solid setup. And I played knight a4. One of the things that I probably should have done right away is played knight h4. In particular, you're looking for something like this. Knight here, some move, queen check here, takes, and takes, right? So we win a rook there, and obviously we're +8 here. We're attacking a knight that's undefended. You know, our opponent can maybe play something like this to defend the knight, but then, yeah, you can just take here, so it's undefended. So, like, clearly, again, we can pose some problems for our opponent. Obviously, I included some dummy moves in order for that to work, but we played knight a4, basically going, I'd like to clean up this bishop. Our opponent goes back, and we take, they take. So this is fine. And so this is the point where I saw basically the tactics that were going on here. So I should have played this earlier, as I'd mentioned before. I don't know if it's a better move. Here, let's take a moment and let's let the lines calculate and see whether or not that's actually a better move to play knight h4 here. No, it wants me to play h3. What happens if I play this? Let's give it a moment. You got to get the depth is only 14 or 15 right here. So this actually apparently gives up some of my advantage if my opponent plays queen d7, basically saving some of this stuff here. But oh, it also wants to play knight ge7. Okay, fair enough. Anyways, we did this stuff first, and then we play knight h4, and our opponent does play knight ge7, which is one of the things that helps defend this square. And so I decided, I still would like to blow up that king side, so I play queen h5 check, g6, knight takes, and so this looks like I'm down material, but I'm not. And the only move that ends up winning the material back is f5. And so I was trying to figure out, like, what is my opponent going to do here? Because how do they defend? You know, this bishop is in here. So my opponent can't step up. So there's actually only one move that saves the knight. Well, there are two. I guess my opponent can play rook g1. And then I could take here. I could also just take with the bishop. Like, you know, there's how do you prevent this capture from being the thing that needs to happen? And the answer is that you play knight ce7. It's knight e7 because this one's pinned, but, you know, nice to specify anyways. And so we take the knight. Our opponent takes back with the knight, and I'm like, oh, cool, a liability. So I play d3. My opponent plays queen e7. And the thing that it wants me to do here is it wants me to play bishop h6 right away, basically getting on this rook and getting on this pawn simultaneously. And I figured I should set it up with rook f1. And that turns out to be a mistake. Because it allows our opponent some free time. What we end up doing is going rook f1, bishop e6, takes, and then a3 so that we can castle without losing this pawn before we end up playing over here. But I think if when we get to this position, we see queen e7, I think if we look at the lines, it wants us to play bishop d5. Okay, so it wants to go here so you can't develop with your bishop. But bishop h6 I think is also a good move here, because if our opponent tries to play here, bishop takes, queen takes. If I play bishop here, I guess that just allows my opponent some free development. But if I don't play bishop g7 and I just go here, it really likes this position. If I castle, so if I castle, then my opponent, I assume, is going to castle queenside. I can go here, and then if my opponent goes here, then I can take this pawn, right? I'm attacking the rook. It's defended by the rook. This knight is still here. This pawn is hanging. Like, that's better than what happened in the game, certainly. Anyways, back to where we were. A3, castles queenside, and I played g3. And I figured, I'm going to move this bishop at some point. I'm going to castle queenside at some point. This pawn is defended. Like, no problems there. But I don't want his knight to have this f5, f4 outpost. Like, also, I don't want my g-pawn to become a liability here. So, obviously, this pawn can't push because just the pawn is going to take and the rook is defending here. But I was like, well, why don't we just make this knight dumb? I don't think that that's actually the best move in this position. It wants to play queen f5 and induce a queen trade. Basically go here, here, and here. And it's like, okay, cool, you can do something like this, but that loses this pawn. So obviously that's dumb. And I guess if you go here, you can play here, but this doesn't seem like the best for our opponent. Anyways, we play g3 because we're just like, this knight is going to suck. We're just going to nurse our small advantage. Our opponent's pawn structure is worse than ours. We're going to be able to target this weakness. So our opponent plays knight e7, recognizing the knight can't go anywhere, so I might as well reroute. I play bishop h6, wanting to go here and then take here. My opponent defends this square, so I can't do that anymore. But because we've already pushed g3, this is not a problem for us. And we castle queenside. So this is totally fine. Our opponent plays knight c6, and he wants to get in here. And when trying to figure out where to retreat my bishop, one of the things that I thought is if I go here, if my opponent goes here, then takes, and now there's some openings here, and like maybe they're going to be able to push something like this, and I don't know how I feel about this. It turns out having 5 pawns on 3 files is not the best thing in the world, and this is a good advantage for us. So bishop e3 is definitely better than what I played. Although actually first I played queen f5, pinning the queen to the king. The queen is undefended, so our opponent is obliged to take. We took with the rook, which I think is correct. We're isolating this weakness. Our opponent plays rook g6, and this is when we move the bishop back. So all the stuff I said before, I should go here, but I didn't. I went here, and I was basically thinking, well, if the knight tries to go over here, which I don't know why it would go over there, but if it tries to go over there, I can take it. Although that's dumb because that straightens out my opponent's pawn structure. So that gives up some of our advantage. Our opponent hops into the middle of the board, and so first thing I do is I recognize our rook is attacked. Now, we can retreat our rook either to here or to here, or we can play rook h5. I decide to play rook f2, which is fine. This is all zeros as far as the computer is concerned. My opponent plays rook f8. I play c3, inducing this check. I can step up with my king. I don't want to go here because then one of these rooks is going to have to take, and I'm releasing the pressure here. So I step up. And one of the things at first that I was calculating is my opponent obviously can't go there. My opponent could go back with their knight, but I'm not sure exactly why they would do that. And I was looking at this before I realized that I still have a rook on the first rank, and that would take. But it took me a minute to calculate that. You know, we're still getting there. So takes and king takes so that we can get our rook over here, and our opponent plays king d7. And we pile up here, 2 rooks defending. So we're the attackers, my opponent's the defenders, and if I can get stuff rolling over here, that's going to be great. My opponent plays king e6, so now perhaps he can move one of his rooks. And I play c4, basically going, I don't really want you to move any stuff over here. I don't think this is necessarily the correct plan. It wants to play rook f5 and just be like, nah, nothing is going to be able to move. You're never going to be able to push f5. Like, no problems, especially if we like play some free moves and eventually our opponent is able to play f5. Obviously takes, and our opponent's is like way further into the position, and basically the only thing that holds us here is this, but then our opponent's going to be able to push down here, maybe take these pawns, and we might be able to run around and grab these pawns, but there are chances on both sides here. So I play c4, and I'm basically like, no, you can't push over here. My opponent plays c6. Basically, they want to get ready one of these pawn pushes, get rid of their doubled pawns. I play b4, and this is another mistake for us. Playing something like a4, preventing this pawn push, is probably a better move. Obviously, if we play a4, push, takes here, then we're fine because we induced another way. Our opponents still have these double pawns. Like, we're doing okay here. This is not really a problem for us. But we play b4, and that gives our opponent a target, which they immediately target. So we go here. Then our opponent plays c5, and I could just push. I could ignore this because then if takes, like this is fine. It wants me to play king c3. So what happens if takes? Oh, I can just play a4, and these triple pawns are dumb. Like, how are you? You're never going to defend this pawn. That makes sense. I don't think I saw this over the board. So I just took. My opponent took back, and I played king c3. My opponent plays king d7, and I played king b3, which it turns out is a mistake. Hanging on to this pawn is fine. Going here, and then when his rook goes back, then I kind of have to go back here. And I still felt like I was pushing for an advantage here, but I've removed some of the weaknesses that my opponent has from the position. So this is not the greatest thing in the world. Anyways, king b3, king c6, and then I go back here because now this pawn is defended. My opponent's king obviously is not going to like walk all the way up in here because my king is here. So my opponent has to go back to play rook f8. So I play rook f3, which is fine. My opponent plays b6. And then I play h4, and that's why I played rook f3, is I want to be able to push things here. But it turns out this is a mistake because now my opponent's semi-open file is against here. And then my opponent played h5 so that this pawn push can't happen. And, maybe if I go like rook g4 and then my opponent goes here, now we're both playing against each other's weaknesses. But like I just play rook f5, which just like drops this pawn. So this is dumb for me. And then I'm like, oh, if I take here and then my opponent takes there, then I have all these like weak pawns over here, which is true. But like that's apparently better than what happened in the game. It also wants me to play rook 1 f3, and then if takes, then like fine, we've lost a pawn, but this one's still backwards. You're not going to be able to push. You're not going to be able to do anything along the h file. In theory, maybe you can get along here, but like my opponent's just not going to be able to do very much in this position. But I play king c3, just going like, okay, admit your mistake, go back with your king, defend this pawn, then eventually you're attacking this pawn and this pawn. My opponent played rook h8 to defend this pawn, so I took this pawn. Fine. So now it ends up, we've traded pawns, we're doing okay. My opponent plays rook h3, and so now the question is like, how can I defend that pawn? And there are a couple of different ways. One is that I can just play rook f5. That's not apparently the best move, but if I play rook 1 f3, if takes h4, then I can play rook e6, and I've got a bunch of other things that I can do. The other thing that I can do is in this position I can play rook f5 and recognize that this pin is happening. So even if takes, then I can take here because there's a pin. And then something like rook f4, and I can go back here, and then it wants to go takes, and then you're behind this passed pawn, I guess. But this doesn't see this. I guess taking in this position is wrong. No, it just wants you to play here, here, and here, and then I guess things are fine. In fact, I'm a pawn in this position. Okay, fair enough. But I played rook e6, which is fine-ish. My opponent takes the pawn. I play rook f6. My opponent plays rook d8. Now you guys should. I know this seems like a boring 2 rooks endgame, but you guys should stick around because first of all, this should be a draw, but it's hard to play, so it might not be. And second of all, there's some really interesting stalemating ideas later. So I play rook h6, getting behind this pawn. Again, one of the things that I could have recognized here is I can just play this. So now it's a 4-on-3 over here, and then it's like a thing over here. I can play something like this, and then I can attack this pawn a bunch of times, no problem. But I don't do that. Instead, I play rook h6, getting behind this pawn. My opponent plays rook h1. I play rook h7, wanting to. If my opponent plays a nothing move, then I play. Oh, sorry, that's not checkmate. Then I can go here, and then if my opponent's trying to push, then I can play. Sorry, mouse slip. I can play checkmate. So that was one of the things that I thought about getting on the 7th rank. Is like, oh, don't see that. My opponent plays rook d7, and what I need to do is just go back. Just be like, nah, nothing's happening. Like, you can push here or whatever, but then I'm just going to get behind your passed pawn. Like, there's not a lot you can do. You can check me over here, but then I'm just going to come down and get you. And if you go over here, then I'm just going to, no matter which way you come to get this pawn, I'm going to get the pawn over here, and there's going to be a 4-on-3, and nothing's going to happen. But instead, I went here, and I was like, I'm threatening your rook. Like, this seems good for me. And he took the rook, and I was like, man, now it's a single rook endgame, which is way harder to defend. Like, this is bad. So my opponent plays h4. I get behind the passed pawn, plays h3, and I play king b3 because what I want to do is a tactic that can happen if I do anything else is my opponent can check me and then promote. So what I want to do is I can either get down to the 2nd rank, and then my opponent can walk all the way around and get their king in. Although I guess with my rook here, my opponent can't move their king, so fair enough. Maybe they can push or something. So maybe being on the 2nd rank is better. But the other thing I can do is I can hide my king on a4 so that doesn't happen. But but perhaps something like king c2 is better. No, it just wants to play b5. Oh, because then my opponent can like unlock their king. Obviously, I don't want to play takes because then king takes and they're walking in. So it just wants me to play something like rook h6 so that if takes, then I can take this pawn. It's still losing for me, but fair enough. Okay, apparently that's not that much better than what I played. I play king b3. My opponent plays h2, and I play king a4 so that, if I played some other meaningless move, then rook b1 check allows queening. So, I go somewhere like here, queens, rook takes, and my opponent's just up a rook, so no good. So I play king a4, and it's like, you could check here, but then I'm just going to step up again. I also, if you play check here, then I can play takes, and you, I guess, can play king b6. But like, what's going on here? I play rook h8, and I can check your king a bunch. I guess rook d1. We're trading these pawns. It's a 3-on-1 over here and a 2-on-0 over here. My king is kind of stuck for the moment, but I can play rook h3. Oh, because this is a stalemate. I can't move. That's why. Fair enough. Sorry about that. Anyways, I play a4, so none of that stuff happens. My opponent plays rook d1. I take the pawn. My opponent takes. And then here's what I saw. My opponent attacks one. So I place. If I play some move like this or like rook b2. In fact, let's go rook b2. My opponent attacks either one of these pawns. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to defend it here. But I could play rook takes b6. And the reason is this is stalemate. My king has no legal moves. This is defended by the king. This is defended by the pawn. This is defended by the rook. All of my pawns are blockaded. So I was like, I can stalemate myself. My opponent plays rook d4. And I'm like, okay, that's the plan. Play rook takes b6. And then my opponent plays king takes b6. And then I was like, that's stalemate, right? And he was like, you can go here. And I was like, fuck. And then he was like, I am so sorry. Like, he apologized to me. I was just like, damn it. I was annoyed. And then I was like, okay, fine. Well, let's try and get ourselves stalemated again. So my opponent plays rook takes e4. I play king c3. My opponent plays rook h4. I play king b3, king a5, a4, e4. Basically, we can just keep pressing the right arrow. I take the pawn. My opponent takes the pawn. Again, we get laggy as we get into the end game. I'm not exactly sure why. Let's turn off the lines. Perhaps that'll help. That does help. And then basically he's going to checkmate me. And I don't know why he didn't just make a queen here, but fine. We get to this position and I eventually get checkmated. But I thought that stalemate trap was good. The fact that it didn't work out wasn't great, but And if we jump over to the game review, we can see I played 83.1. My opponent played 89.7. And we did have an advantage at the beginning. We just didn't convert it correctly. And then it was drawing for a while. And I just didn't want to accept in this double Rook Endgame. I was like, I should be better here. I should be able to turn this into a win. And it turns out just 2 rooks versus 2 rooks is almost never a win. I needed to find a way to force my opponent to trade me rooks, and then it potentially could have worked. So potentially something like this, and then over here is a better plan than what I played. But also I was pushing too much, and that ended up losing me the game. I should recognize when things are draws. I just didn't want it to be because I was like, I feel like I should be better here, but my opponent's weaknesses just didn't matter. Anyway, still a pretty good game. Playing 83. Sometimes that's good enough for me to win. So if I can play that, great. And I think we're going to keep on going with the King's Gambit. Anyways, let's see what this did to my rating. This one hurts. So our last opponent was rated 986, and so we lost. So our turn performance is still 1.5, and so our performance goes down to 1042, and our rating goes down to 1111. So we end up going from gaining rating points to losing rating points just by losing that one game, which is pretty rough. But that's okay. We're trying to get a rating that we deserve, and it appears that we're a little bit. It appears that we're narrowing in closer on where we should be because we're gaining or losing just a few points. So we're feeling okay about that. Anyways, let's take a look at the graph. So just to show you how brutal that last game was, we got a win in round 1 against a low-rated opponent, gained about 16 points. We got a loss to somebody higher rated, lost about 11 points. We got a draw against somebody higher rated, we gained about 12 points. Then we lost to somebody lower rated and lost 35 points. Oh, brutal. So we'll have to see where things go from here, but that does not feel good. It turns out that our tournament has been rated and. Our actual post-event rating is actually only 1120, and it's because some of our opponents were higher rated than they seemed. Joshua Garrow, I think he'd moved all the way up to 1400 from 1311. It turns out we didn't actually do as badly as we thought. We ended up losing 9 rating points. So we need to score a little bit better, but a half point better would have put us in a pretty good position here. That's about where we'd expect to be as 2 out of 4 from that group. So, we'll learn from this. but it was a fun one. Let's see how I'm feeling after the game.
Well, last round's over. We got to play our King's Gambit. And our opponent played f6, which I've never seen before, and the computer does not love. It already gives white like a pawn and a half advantage. Um, but we played through the beginning. I used some tactics. My opponent defended reasonably well, like the only way that they could have. But I was glad to be posing the problems. And then we got into a middle game, and I was able to apply a little bit of pressure on my opponent, had backwards pawn, and then we got to like 2 rooks and 7 pawns versus 2 rooks and 7 pawns, and I just tried too hard to like make something happen. It's a draw. It's a draw where like if black ever messes up, maybe white will do okay. But I screwed up. I played something and then went like, oh no. I mean, I didn't say it out loud, but that's how I was feeling. My opponent played the proper response, and then it's still supposed to be a draw. But it gets a lot harder. It goes from like none of it can do anything to like, oh shit, like I have to play the perfect move a lot. And then I made like another blunder that went from like, okay, it's hard to draw, but you can do it, to like, this is probably winning for your opponent. And then at the end, I thought I had a stalemate trick, but it worked when my opponent played like 2 of the 3 moves that seemed reasonable, and they played the 3rd move, and then I played it anyways, which I was losing anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But then they like, I sacrificed my rook. They took with their king. I was like, a stalemate, right? And they were like, no, this is a legal move. And I was like, ah, fuck. And they were like, I am so sorry. And it was like, okay. So I played through, which was fine, just trying to see. But we lost that game. Bit of a bummer, but can't complain too much. It was a fun day of chess. 1.5 out of 4 is not the worst result we've had. And we're putting ourselves in positions where they're like equal end games. So as long as we stop blundering those, we should be in a pretty good position moving forward. So can't complain too much about that. So not our greatest showing. After 3 rounds, I think I was going to gain a little bit of rating. I think at this point we might be even, a little bit unclear. I played like 2 people in the 1300s and 2 people in the high 900s, so that averages out to the low 1100s, right? It averages out to like the mid 1100s, but we scored just below 2. So I'll figure it out. You'll see. I'll have the graph and stuff. Anyways, appreciate having you guys around. Always fun to play some chess, and I'll see you guys next time I have a tournament.